Hello, welcome to the Bible Standard. In this thought-provoking study, we explore the profound distinction between seeing world events through a human lens and discerning them through the lens of Scripture. How can we be more than just servants, but become true friends of Christ through prophecy? We delve into the examples of Abraham and Habakkuk to understand how living a faith responds to God's revealed purpose, especially in times of geopolitical upheaval and shifting global powers. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and drop us a comment in the comment section to have your say. We love to hear your thoughts.
We want to think a little bit more about prophecy. We're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about some of the signs of the times that are going on a slightly broader scale than individual events. We'll try and sort of make that clear as we are going through that that's what we're doing. And then we also want to show something of what Jesus told us about those who hear his voice. Now, you will recognize the quotation for the talk is taken from Matthew chapter 16. You don't need to turn to Matthew chapter 16 just yet. What we're going to do is sort of meander our way towards Matthew chapter 16, and then we will arrive at Matthew chapter 16 and talk a little bit about this incident that is going on between Jesus and the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Matthew 16, and what it tells us about the signs of the times and our own response to prophecy. But first, I wonder if we could open our Bibles, or turn our Bibles, if they're already open, to the Gospel of John and chapter 15, please. So in John chapter 15, Jesus says something that is interesting for us to think about in relation to this topic of prophecy. Because Jesus says in John chapter 15, in the context of his commandment to his disciples to love one another, in verse 12, Jesus says in verse 13, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." And then Jesus goes on to talk a little bit about who are the friends of Jesus. He says in verse 14, "You are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you." So there's the basic definition of a friend of Jesus, the obedience to his commands. And then he says something really interesting in verse 15 in relation to what we're thinking about. "Henceforth," he says, "I call you not servants or slaves," as the Greek should be translated. "For the slave knoweth not what his Lord doeth. But I have called you friends, for all things that I have heard of my Father, I have made known unto you." And isn't that important for us? We can be the friends if we do whatsoever we are commanded. And that sounds an awful lot like a servant, doesn't it? That sounds like someone who is given a command and goes away and does it. But the distinction that Jesus makes is the friend is obedient to the command because they've had revealed to them why the command has been made. That if we were just slaves, then understanding why we were doing anything is not essential. Slave doesn't need to know, wouldn't expect to know at the time of Jesus why they were being asked to do something. You go and you do it, and they do it. That's the example that's given, isn't it, by the centurion when he is talking to Christ. And he says, "I'm a man under authority." And he says, I tell my servants to go and do, and they go and do. And he explained, he's talking, isn't he, about what he expects Jesus can do, because Jesus has that authority as well. But Jesus says, you're not just slaves, because I have explained to you, I have shown you the mind of God, and you understand why you follow. And prophecy is a part of that, isn't it? God has revealed his purpose and shown what is to come. And so we understand when we are given commands. Why? Because they're based in the character of God and point forward to what is to come in the future. There is a distinction between servants and friends, between slaves and friends, it probably should say up on the screen. But now come and have a look at Revelation in chapter 1, because there's an interesting distinction, or an interesting difference that's made here, isn't there? Because in Revelation chapter 1, we are told in verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show to his, and again the word should be slaves here, it's the same word as is used in John chapter 15, to show to his slaves things which must shortly come to pass. And so there is a process here. Jesus says in John chapter 15, you are my friends because I have shown you everything that my Father has told me. And here in Revelation, God gives Jesus that pattern of the future, that prophecy of what is to come, so that Jesus can show it to his servants, the things which must shortly come to pass. And so the process seems to go. Jesus reveals things, reveals this prophecy of God in Revelation here to his servants so that they might become his friends. And there's an onus then on us, isn't there? That this has been revealed to us so that might urge us on to be the friends of Christ and to keep the commandments which he has given to us. Now I want you to think about the man Abraham. Come back to Psalm 105, please. Because what's interesting about Abraham is that Abraham falls into both of these categories. So Psalm 105 and verse 6, talking to the nation of Israel. We've already thought about Psalm 105 today, but here it is again. Psalm 105 and verse 6 says, O ye seed of Abraham, his servant, ye children of Jacob, his chosen. Abraham is the servant of God, Psalm 105 tells us. And if we carry on down Psalm 105 and look at verse 42, we see the same thing. He remembered his holy promise, and Abraham his servant, and he brought forth his people with joy, and his chosen with gladness. So Abraham as a servant is related to the fulfillment of the promises that God made to him. So Abraham is the servant of God. But we know as well, don't we, brothers and sisters, that Abraham is the friend of God. If you just come over to the prophecy of Isaiah, have a look at Isaiah chapter 41. And Isaiah takes the language of Psalm 105 and sort of manipulates it a little bit. So Isaiah 41 and verse 8 says, "But thou, Israel, art my servant, Jacob whom I have chosen." So there's the direct connection back to Psalm 105. But then it says, "the seed of Abraham," and you remember back in Psalm 105, Abraham was the servant. But here in Isaiah chapter 41, Abraham is the friend of God. The seed of Abraham, my friend. And if we were just to flick over, and you don't need to do this unless you would like to, but in the letter to James, and James in chapter 2, we have that confirmed for us. The same thing is said. In James chapter 2 and verse 23, it says, "The scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God, it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." And so we've got both of these, the servant and the friend, bound up in this man, Abraham. And we want to ask ourselves why, and how does this relate to prophecy? Well, what is going on here? Well, just come back to the letter to the Galatians in chapter 3. Because we've seen in James already the key characteristic of the man Abraham, and we know it. This is not telling us anything that we don't already know. But Galatians chapter 3 tells us, doesn't it, in verse 6, "Even as Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Know ye therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham." And so we're right back now where we were at the beginning of our first talk, which is probably going to make you wonder why on earth you've spent all this time listening to me if we've just arrived back at the same place. But there we are. 2nd of Peter tells us, doesn't it, that we have a precious faith. And it is the faith of Abraham. They which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. The scripture foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, "In thee shall all nations be blessed." And we're back again with what we were thinking about with Brother Dan, aren't we? That our hope is the hope of Israel, bound up in the faith that Abraham had in the promise which God made. So, says verse 9, "they which be of faith are blessed with faithful Abraham." Abraham was the servant who obeyed the commands of God, and so is called the friend of God. And the archetypal quality and criteria, the characteristic of Abraham, is that when God spoke, he believed. And the fundamental point in relation to what we're thinking about in terms of prophecy is that when God speaks, we believe. We saw it with what Brother Dan was saying when God spoke of the return of the nation of Israel. And that early group of Christadelphian believers looked at the land of Israel and saw a swamp and a wilderness. But they believed what God had said. And we, brothers and sisters, when we think about what God has spoken of what is to come, we believe that what God has said will happen. No matter the evidence that's in front of our eyes. We saw an example of it in terms of, Brother Stevens mentioned what Donald Trump said about the everlasting peace in the Middle East. And one of the things he said was that one of the steps that had brought us to that point was him contacting Netanyahu and saying to Netanyahu, "You can't beat the world." Now, that's not true, is it? God has told us that in the end, Israel will be the world. But Donald Trump, looking at it, says that you can't do it. It's not possible. But we believe what God has said. And that puts us, doesn't it, in the family of Abraham. Now, I just want to show you this. Just come back to Genesis in chapter 18, please. Yeah. Because I want to show you what Abraham's response is. We say we believe what God says, and we absolutely do. But look at what Abraham does. So, in Genesis chapter 18, God says in verse 17, the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do?" That's then connected, isn't it, to what Jesus said in John chapter 15 about what he was going to do in revealing what he had heard from his Father. And God says here in verse 17, the angel representing God says, "Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment." So look what the angel says. That the way of the Lord here in this context is to do justice and judgment. And the Lord, it says, may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of. But the way of the Lord is to do justice and judgment. And so the angel then reveals to Abraham what's going to happen. I'm going to destroy Sodom. And look what Abraham says. Verse 23, "Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked?" So Abraham has had a prophecy revealed to him, hasn't he? The angel says, this is what is going to happen. Sodom is going to be destroyed. I'm going to do it. And Abraham asks a question. "Wilt thou destroy the righteous with the wicked?" Verse 24, "What if there are 50 righteous within the city? Are you going to destroy and not spare the place for the 50 that are therein?" And why does Abraham ask the question? Because in verse 25 he says, "That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" And that word "right" there is the same word as the word for judgment there in verse 19, when the angel said the way of the Lord was to do justice and judgment. And Abraham asks the question, are you really going to do this? Because of what Abraham knows about the character of God. Abraham wants to understand how what God has said will happen fits in with what Abraham understands about who God is. And that, brothers and sisters, is the faith of Abraham. that he believed that what God said would happen, and he knew it would happen according to what he knew about God. And this is a really crucial point when we're thinking about prophecy, that we understand this, that God has said what will happen, and we understand that in accordance with what we know about who God is. Just have a look at another example. Come forward to the prophecy of Isaiah in chapter 10. Because this is not the way the world views things. And that's the distinction between the friends, that they see things and recognise them in accordance with the character of God. So in Isaiah chapter 10, we have the prophecy, don't we, of Assyria. Verse 5 says, "O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger and the staff in their hand is mine indignation. I will send him against a hypocritical nation, and against the people of my wrath will I give him a charge." And so God is going to send the Assyrians. There is the divine hand in these actions. But in verse 7 it says, "Howbeit he meaneth not so, neither doth his heart think so, but it is in his heart to destroy and cut off nations, not a few." So there is the human intention. And looking at this one event, you can see it in two completely different lights. You can see it as being the intention of God to fulfill his purpose in bringing his wrath against the wicked. But for the world, it fits into the human intention of the Assyrian to take nations. And that's, of course, not the only example, is it? If we come and have a look at the prophecy of Habakkuk, we see exactly the same thing with the Chaldeans. And what we see here is Habakkuk's own reaction and response to this. Because Habakkuk's asked the question, hasn't he? At the beginning of Habakkuk chapter 1, how long is God going to not do anything? And so God's response is to show to Habakkuk what it is he's going to do. And he tells Habakkuk in verse 5 to look at the nations and regard and wonder marvellously, because God was going to work a work. And from verse 5 down to verse 10, God shows that it's the Chaldeans who he's going to send against the nation of Israel. And then God says in verse 11, "Then shall his mind change, and he shall pass over and offend, imputing this, his power, to his God." So it's exactly the same as with the Assyrians. The Chaldeans are going to go down and they're going to do the work of God, but they're not going to know it. They're not going to recognize it. They're not going to see it. And they are going to impute their power to their own gods. There is no recognition of God's hand. This is the distinction between servants and friends. That they don't see what God is doing. But Habakkuk has a very similar question to Abraham. Habakkuk says in verse 12, "Art thou not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, thou hast ordained them for judgment, and, O mighty God, thou hast established them for correction. Thou art of purer eyes than to behold evil." So Habakkuk asks the question, based on what he understands about God, how can you use the Chaldeans? They're terrible. They are an awful people. They are worse than we are. How could you use them to bring this judgment. And I want to be very clear here. Habakkuk doesn't doubt God's word, does he? Habakkuk might not understand how it fits with the character of God, but he doesn't doubt it. He never says, well, that's not going to happen. Habakkuk wants to understand how what God has revealed will happen, how that fits with what he understands about God. And that is answered then by God, isn't it? In Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 1, Habakkuk says, I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower and will watch to see what he will say unto me and what I shall answer when I am reproved. And in the end of Habakkuk, we get that glorious picture of what God is going to do in the end. And what God is showing to Habakkuk is that I will fulfill my purpose. And it might look like there are lots of steps along the way, but I am fulfilling my purpose. And we see lots of steps, don't we? I want to take you back to October the 16th, so 9 days ago. And on October the 16th, this was an article in the Financial Times explaining the Tomahawk missiles that Trump was considering to sell to Ukraine and showing what they could do and how these missiles could go into Moscow and how they could threaten Russia in Russia's own land. And that consideration went on for the vast length of time of at least 3 days. Because on October the 19th, we were told that Trump and Zelensky met at the White House amid debate over Tomahawk missiles for Ukraine. And Zelensky had visited Trump in the White House to talk to him about these missiles that Trump was considering sending to Ukraine. Move forward. That was October the 18th, not October the 19th. On October the 18th as well, there were reports that the White House, by which read President Trump, eyes Budapest for peace talks with Zelensky and Putin. You will remember all of these stories coming up in the news in the last week or so of the meeting that was going to be in Budapest. And you will remember Trump's spokeswoman was asked a question about, do you think that actually Budapest might not be the best place because of the historical connections that there were between Russia and Hungary and the Ukraine? And isn't Budapest slightly thoughtless in terms of this meeting? But there was a meeting planned between Trump and Putin and Zelensky. But then it emerged, this is October the 20th, this article came out, that there was a shouting match at the White House. Trump cursed through maps and told Zelensky, Putin will destroy you. So this meeting where Zelensky had gone to talk about the Tomahawk missiles that Trump was considering sending to them devolved into this shouting match between the two, where Trump, we are told, having had a 2.5-hour phone call with Putin, said that Putin had conveyed to him in a phone call the day before that the Russian economy is in great shape and that he'd refused to send Tomahawk missiles and demanded that Zelensky accept Moscow's surrender terms. So we've moved on if this is reporting the meeting on the 18th, a whole 2 days. And the situation has entirely changed. And then we move on again. That was October the 20th. October the 21st, The Trump-Putin-Budapest talks are on hold, but Europe is still on edge, were the reports on the 21st of October. Because these talks, Trump had changed his mind again, and we had moved on from the situation as it had been earlier that week. And then the BBC were reporting, Trump abandons the carrot and wields the stick over Putin in Ukraine talks. So having offered these talks, the idea of taking them again away was considered to be the stick instead of the carrot. That was then followed by sanctions. Trump says that Putin talks don't go anywhere as he imposes new sanctions against Russia. And that caused this response from Putin, that was October the 22nd and 23rd. And then that caused this response from Putin, who was defiant after Trump sanctions Russian oil companies over Ukraine. This is the world that we live in at the moment. These are the events that are happening over a period of roughly a week. The situation changes on the whims of one man, and seemingly whoever he's just spoken to. He is malleable, it seems, to that extent that whoever he's just had a conversation with is the person that he is going to side with that day. And then we were told Trump sanctions target Russian war ATM, but the real test is enforcement. And there are questions over whether or not anything's going to happen and whether the sanctions will be employed. And we can get caught up, can't we? In all of these events and all of these happenings, everything seems to be happening. And Donald Trump is appearing in front of a microphone roughly every 20 minutes to say something contradictory to what he'd said the 20 minutes before that. And as Bible students and as students of prophecy, what can we hang on to but our faith that what God has said will happen will happen. And as the friends, how that then causes us to keep his commandments. It is very hard, isn't it, to see a pattern through the events that are going on at the moment. But if you take a step back and have a think about what is happening, there is a spirit that pervades what is going on. So back in 2018, Time magazine ran that. That was you. None of you knew what date that was because I hadn't put it up on the screen, but now I have. It was October the 24th. It was yesterday. That's when that article came out. I'm so sorry. In 2018, Time magazine ran an article or an issue on what it called the rise of the strongman. There's Putin there over the top of Rodrigo Duterte, who was the leader of the Philippines, who is currently the mayor of Davao City. At the bottom there is Viktor Orban of Hungary, and then on the left-hand side of the screen is Erdogan of Turkey. And it talked about how strong men were becoming more prominent and more prevalent within society. In 2018 as well, there was another article, The Rise of Strongman Politics, there on the right-hand side of the screen, which highlighted Donald Trump as well and brought him into this particular scenario. That has continued, that way of thinking in terms of sort of political science and political theory has carried on. So in 2022, on the left-hand side of the screen, on the right-hand side of the screen, The book by Gideon Rachman, who was writing for the Financial Times a few years earlier to this, and who sort of posited this idea of the rise of the strongman. His book came out in 2022. And then in 2023, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen an article written for the University of Virginia, again, on the rise of the strongman presidency, and this time focusing particularly on America and what was going on there in terms of the presidency, which has led to the things that we see from Donald Trump today. That whole backwards and forwards over that past week or so is as a result of what political theorists would describe as Donald Trump acting out the part of a strong man. You will probably have seen over the last week, again, pictures like this, where Trump has decided instead of the east wing of the White House, he would very much like a ballroom. And so the east wing of the White House has been demolished. Why this is interesting is that he's done it without congressional approval and very probably illegally. Based on the use of money which has gone into doing this. He can't use those funds for this purpose. But it hasn't stopped him, has it? He's done it entirely without let or hindrance, as we can use the phrase. Because he acts seeing himself above the law. Now, why is this interesting? Well, I think it's interesting because of what we understand about the state of things at the end before Christ returns. There are a few more of these as well. This was, I can't read the slide, it's far too small. You can't read the slide because it's far too small as well. The title is Strong Men I can't read the slide because the other slide has covered it up on my thing. So anyway, you can read that. I'm sure you're all delighted by it. There is another one, Anti-Establishment versus Authoritarian Populists and Support for the Strong. And this was written by two women, so they included the idea of a woman as well, just, for balance, I suppose. The point is that this is a growing set of sort of theories which have all come together to show that around the world, highlighted particularly with the state of affairs in America, there is this rise of what political theorists would call populism and the idea of the strong man. Particularly young people today are looking for a strong man as the leader and turning their backs on Western, liberal, democratically led, rule of law governed politics. Which brings us to this article. In 1989, a man called Francis Fukuyama, who was deputy director of an analyst station for American diplomacy, wrote an article in the national interest called The End of History, ? In it, he argued that Western liberal democracy had won, that there was no other viable political ideology. This came right at the end of the Cold War, as Russia and Gorbachev were moving away from, they wouldn't have said necessarily away from communism, but they were moving away from that contention with the West. The wall was coming down, and it looked like liberal democracy had won the day. There was no other alternative. That then became a book that he wrote 2 or 3 years later with the same title that had the same thesis in it. I'm going to read you a little section from that, and I want you to think about what we would think about sort of strongman politics. Think about it in terms of Donald Trump today. He wrote, the general principle, he's talking about the reforms that happened to the Soviet constitution under Gorbachev that sort of led him to this idea. He said the general principles underlying many of the reforms, that the people should be responsible for their own affairs, higher political bodies should be answerable to lower ones and not vice versa. The rule of law should prevail over arbitrary police actions with separation of powers and an independent judiciary. There should be legal protection for property rights, so you don't just get to pull down the White House. The need for open discussion of public issues, the right of public dissent, the empowering of the Soviets as a forum in which the whole Soviet people can participate. What he is saying is, this is liberal democracy in action in Russia. The West has won. There is a whole section about China as well, and how he talks about Asia and the overcoming of Western liberal democracy there too. And for most of my lifetime, that has been the case. That we have lived, I suppose the way you would sum it up is, people used to say there were no two countries who both had a McDonald's who had gone to war with each other. There had never been a war between two countries that both had a McDonald's. And it's that idea. And we were living in a world where it seemed like that was it. We had reached the end of history and we were just waiting for the end to play out. But that's not where we are today, is it? That is not the state of affairs today. And people have started writing articles talking about the end of history and how we have moved away from that thought. And as Bible students, of course, we wouldn't be surprised at that, would we? We have already looked at Elpis Israel a number of times this afternoon. In the preface to Elpis Israel, Brother Thomas wrote, the future movements of Russia, the London edition of Elpis Israel, in the preface, the future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times because they're predicted in the scriptures of truth. The Russian autocracy, in its plenitude and on the verge of its dissolution, is the image of Nebuchadnezzar standing upon the mountains of Israel, ready to be smitten by the stone. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things, as at present constituted, is at hand. You could not have said, based on what political theorists were talking about, that Gorbachev was that man. But we're living in a world now where Putin, as the autocrat of Russia, can fulfill this picture that we read of here. I say here in Ezekiel 38. None of you have turned to Ezekiel 38, and I'm still in Habakkuk. We know what we're referring to, don't we? And Brother Thomas continued to talk about the autocrat of Russia. From these premises, then, I think there cannot be the shadow of a doubt that the autocrat of Russia, when he shall have attained to the plenitude of his power and dominion, is the subject of the prophecy contained in the 38th and 39th chapters of Ezekiel. And then in 1851, in the Herald of the Kingdom Age, peace is not God's order of the day. The sword must be unsheathed. The Austrian Empire must be destroyed. The Roman false prophet must be uncrowned. The Turkish dominion must be dried up. Russia must reconstitute the dragon empire of the East and West. Egypt and Persia must be subjected to the Autocrat. And under a system of politics where Western liberal democracy has won the day, it's hard to see that happening. But over the last 10 years or so, what we have seen is the state of affairs in the political heavens move to a situation where we can see this coming to pass before our eyes. That there are men, particularly men, who we could refer to as autocrats, not just of Russia, but around the world.
Crazy.
At the beginning of this article in the Herald of the Kingdom Age, it says, the political aspect of affairs in the prophetic world is becoming more and more threatening every day. This is 150. Please do the maths for me. It's 1851, 175 years ago. By the prophetic world, we mean that civil and ecclesiastical constitution of things which obtains upon the area of the Roman Empire, old and new, whose revolutions and final destiny are noted in the scriptures of truth. We see what is coming to pass in the world today as fitting this theme that our brethren have been writing about for well over 100 years. That's the same thing. Excellent. 1854, 3 years later. Now let us inquire what power at the time of the end so well answers the description of the King of the North as the great northern autocrat, who, like a mighty colossus at this moment, is holding the civilized world in wondering suspense, if not apprehension, as to his movements. Again, that was written 170 years ago, 171 years ago. And today, we have what people might call the civilized world gathering in suspense and apprehension as to the movements of the great northern autocrat. Starmer says Putin not serious about peace after meeting Zelensky and European allies, which happened just earlier this week. Brothers and sisters, the events which are happening in the world, whilst in and of themselves on an individual basis, go this way and that way, overall, we can see the trend moving to the situation to come, which presages the coming of the Lord. Meanwhile, though, in the ecclesiastical world, just come over with me to the book of Revelation. Have a look at Revelation chapter 17. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see an article about the dramatic growth in church attendance by young people, a study by the Bible Society showed. This was earlier this year. And in Revelation chapter 17, we read, don't we, in verse 3, where John is carried away in the Spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-coloured beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And we have this alternate religious system in place to oppose the Lamb when he comes. And this woman, we're told in verse 4, was arrayed in purple and scarlet colour and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And we have in the world today that system gathering its daughters together. King Charles makes history by praying publicly with Pope Leo. And this in itself is, again, just an event. But it speaks to us, doesn't it, of the coming together of the ecclesiastical system, gathered by the mother, drawing her harlot daughters to her. And it's interesting that on the left-hand side, the dramatic growth in church attendance is particularly amongst Catholics. The study says a rapid growth in church attendance is being powered by an increase amongst Gen Z, or Gen Z, if we're going to be American about it, especially in the Catholic Church. Gen Z, roughly 13 to 28-year-olds. If you're in that category, you are a Gen Z person, born between 97 and 2012. And that group of people, the survey showed, is going towards the Catholic Church at a higher rate than any other age group is going towards any other denomination. It is that group of people and that church. Because the Catholic Church is drawing people back to it. We are seeing the drawing back in of Christian churches to the mother church in order that when the time comes, they will speak with the voice of the false prophet, and it will be one voice. For, says Revelation 16 and verse 14, they are the spirits of demons working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. And I didn't include any references to anti-Semitism and the gathering of the world against the Jews, that great sign of our age, which Revelation chapter 16 points to, of the nations coming against the land of Israel, the day of vengeance for Gaza. In case it trod on Brother Dan's ground that he was going to be talking about in the earlier talk. I didn't include any of that, but it is not difficult to find. There was a survey done earlier this year led by Penny Mordaunt and a Labour MP, whose name I can't remember, surveying the rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic activity in particular that is going on in the UK. But it is going on around the world. As this voice goes out to cause people to turn against the Jews. The three frog-like spirits, which we historically in our community have connected, haven't we, with the spirit of the French Revolution, that spirit of liberty, equality and fraternity. Which is interesting, because in 2020, the old Pope, Pope Francis, wrote an encyclical which was entitled Fratelli Tutti, and in it he spoke of liberty, equality and fraternity, and how actually you can't have liberty and equality without having fraternity. That the world needs to come together in a brotherhood, and then there will be true liberty and there will be true equality. That was the argument that he was making. And we know that the new Pope, Pope Leo, is a disciple of Francis and follows in his footsteps and has continued his agenda. It is the mouth of the false prophet speaking these words as it gathers together the church. That is the world that we are in today. I said we would meander our way to Matthew chapter 16. I want you to come now to Matthew chapter 16. Because Jesus is going to teach the scribes, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, what we have already seen about servants and friends. So in Matthew chapter 16, we're going to go through this reasonably quickly. In Matthew chapter 16, we're told right at the very end of Matthew 15, the coasts of Magdala. We've just had the feeding of the 4,000 on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus has moved his way and made his way across from the eastern shore to the western shore, to Magdala, just there on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus has done that deliberately and specifically. Verse 39 tells us he sends away the multitude, he takes ship, he comes into the coasts of Magdala. This was a deliberate decision. There is a reason Jesus has come to this place. And the reason is because the name Magdala is a name which means a tower. And what we find, and we're not going to go through this now, but what we find is that the Old Testament depicts for us two towers. There is Genesis chapter 11 and the tower, it's not only two towers. The word comes a number of times. The Hebrew word migdal. But there are two towers set in opposition to each other. In Genesis chapter 11, there is the Tower of Babel. It's this same word. In Micah chapter 4, we are introduced to the Tower of the Flock. And God sets up these two towers in opposition to each other to say, which one are you going to be part of? Will you be part of the system of the Tower of Babel, which stands separate from me? Or will you come to the Tower of the Flock, where I have placed refuge for my people? And Jesus is going to show that distinction to the Pharisees and the Sadducees who come to him, we're told in Matthew chapter 16 verse 1, tempting him, and they desired that he would show them a sign from heaven. And he says, when it is evening, you say it will be fair weather. And Jesus is coming in now to the final year of his ministry. He begins in verse 21 of Matthew chapter 16 to show to his disciples how he must go to Jerusalem. This is the evening. The darkness is coming. But what were they focused on? When it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. When it is morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. The word for foul weather comes here in Matthew chapter 16, and it comes in John chapter 10. John chapter 10 and verse 22, it's translated as winter. And we are told it is the feast of the dedication. And in John chapter 10, and we're not going to go there for time, but in John chapter 10, the whole point is Jesus revealing to the leaders of Israel, I've shown you who I am, and you did not believe me. It is about Jesus saying all the things that I've done and you would not believe. I've revealed to you who I am. And you wouldn't see it. And it links us back to Numbers chapter 7, that again, we're not going to go there. But it's in the context of Jesus saying about himself as the shepherd and the sheep following his voice. And brothers and sisters, there is the distinction that is set out for us. You are my friends, says Jesus, if you do whatsoever I command you. If we hear the voice of the Lord. All they could hear, the scribes and the Pharisees, was the natural clamour of the world around them. And they understood that. You know what the weather's going to be like because of what the sky looks like. You can discern the face of the sky. The word for discerning means to separate one from another. You can make a judgment without doubt about natural things. And they were wrong. Because they couldn't see what was in front of them. They could not see the hand of God in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. So much is going on. And so many people in the world are very eager to tell us it's going to be fair weather or foul weather. But they can't see the hand of God. And the crucial point, the important point for us, brothers and sisters, is not to get swept away, but to hear the voice of the Lord and to trust him. We can see the signs in the world that show that God is working. Let's not get lost in Russia's taken this much territory. Russia's been beaten back. Let us trust in what God has said and have faith in that. We read James chapter 1. We will finish here. Because in James chapter 1, we have the picture, don't we, of the trying of your faith. Knowing this, that the trying of your faith works patience. Yeah. And just as it was with Abraham, brothers and sisters, and just as it was with Habakkuk, sometimes we look at things and we say, how does this fit? But what we can't say is, this must mean that what we've understood for 170 years must be wrong. Let us hear the voice of the Lord in the word of the Lord, and let us trust in that. And let us be, brothers and sisters, in faith, nothing wavering. That word, nothing wavering, is the same word as the word for discerning the sky. Back in Matthew chapter 16, they didn't doubt at all that they knew what was coming. And that was natural things. We, brothers and sisters, have been revealed to us the spiritual end. Let us have faith that God will bring about his purpose, and that in accordance with his character and his plan, his Son will return, his glory will fill the world, and by his grace we might be part of that light. Thank you.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comments section and let us know what you thought. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.